In the sleek, glass-lined lobby of Horizon Tower, Dr. Zora Mitchell was moments away from unlocking the doors to her own research lab, until a corporate security consultant named Karen decided she didn't belong there. What started as a late-night work session spiraled into a public spectacle of racial profiling when Karen Whitfield demanded proof that Zora had any right to be in the building at all. Dr. Zora Mitchell wasn't just any employee. For over a decade, she had built a reputation as a leading expert in AI ethics, uncovering biases in facial recognition technology, biases that disproportionately misidentified women like her. She was the founder and director of the Mitchell AI Ethics Lab, a cutting-edge research hub funded by national grants and housed in this very building. When Karen escalated, calling the police and claiming she felt unsafe, she had no idea she was targeting a powerhouse in the tech world. Zora's calm, strategic response would set off a chain of events that exposed Karen's hypocrisy, turning a private humiliation into a viral reckoning. What began as a petty power trip would become a national controversy, and Horizon Tower would never forget the night a so-called diversity consultant revealed her own deep biases on camera. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sleek glass facade of Horizon Tower caught the last glimmers of sunset as Dr. Zora Mitchell pushed through the revolving doors into the lobby. At 9:47 p.m., the building stood nearly deserted, just how she preferred it when deadline pressure loomed. The atrium's ambient lighting had dimmed to its evening setting, casting long shadows across polished concrete floors as her heels clicked a steady rhythm toward the elevator bank. Tomorrow's presentation to the National Science Foundation couldn't wait until morning. The facial recognition algorithm her team had developed was revealing disturbing patterns of bias, particularly against women with darker skin tones, women like her. 3 more tests to run, and then she could finalize her slides with the updated data. Just a few hours, she murmured to herself as the elevator ascended to the 12th floor. The solitude felt comforting after a dinner meeting that had run long with questions about her groundbreaking research. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime. Zora adjusted her messenger bag and strode confidently down the hallway, her ID badge swinging from the lanyard around her neck. The Mitchell AI Ethics Lab occupied the northeast corner of the floor, premium real estate within the tech incubator that housed dozens of progressive startups. The recent infusion of grant funding had doubled her team size and upgraded their equipment, which made the late nights worthwhile. Reaching her lab's glass door, Zora retrieved her keycard and swiped it through the reader. The familiar green light blinked, and she reached for the handle when a sharp voice pierced the silence. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Zora turned to find a white woman with a sleek blonde bob and an expensive-looking blazer approaching. Rapidly, her face set in a mask of suspicion. A visitor badge was clipped to her lapel. "I'm going into my lab," Zora replied evenly, gesturing toward the door where Mitchell AI Ethics Lab was etched in modern sans serif lettering. The woman crossed her arms. "And you are?" "Dr. Zora Mitchell." She touched her ID badge, which displayed her photograph, name, and title clearly. "This is my lab. I'm Karen Whitfield, new security consultant for the building." Her eyes narrowed as she inspected Zora's badge without touching it. "How do I know that's actually yours? ID badges can be stolen." A familiar weight settled in Zora's chest, the leaden feeling that accompanied these interactions. She had navigated this particular obstacle course too many times before. Remain calm, speak clearly, don't show frustration, maintain professionalism while being treated as inherently suspicious. "As you can see, it has my photo on it, and my keycard works." Zora kept her voice measured, gesturing to the door's green indicator light. "I'm the principal investigator here. I have some urgent work to complete tonight." Karen's posture remained rigid. "It's highly unusual for someone to be entering the building this late. What exactly are you working on that's so important it can't wait until business hours?" The question carried an unmistakable subtext. Justify your presence. Prove you belong. Zora took a deep breath. I'm finalizing research on algorithmic bias in facial recognition technology. We've discovered significant disparities in how these systems identify people of different races and genders. I have a presentation to the National Science Foundation tomorrow morning. Her credentials, PhD from MIT, recognized expert in her field, recipient of multiple research grants, should not have been necessary to access her own workspace. Yet here she stood, reciting her accomplishments like a supplicant. Karen appeared, unmoved. I wasn't notified about anyone working after hours. Do you have special authorization? I don't need special authorization. All employees with keycards have 24/7 building access. That's been the policy since Horizon Tower opened. Zora maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. You can verify with Amelia Richardson, the incubator CEO, though I'd rather not disturb her at this hour. I'm going to need to see additional identification, Karen insisted, extending her hand expectantly. From the corner of her eye, Zora noticed movement. Marcus Chen, a social media manager from the marketing firm down the hall, had emerged from his office. He hesitated by his door, smartphone partially raised, uncertainty written across his face. This is ridiculous, Zora stated, firmly, though her tone remained professional. My badge and keycard are sufficient identification. I've worked in this building for 3 years. Karen's hand moved to her phone. If you have nothing to hide, providing ID shouldn't be a problem. This is standard security protocol. It is not standard protocol to demand additional identification from employees with valid badges and functioning keycards, Zora countered, her patience wearing thin but her composure intact. Years of being the only black woman in academic and professional spaces had honed this skill to a fine edge. Marcus had fully emerged from his office now. His phone was definitely recording. Several other late workers had appeared in doorways, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Karen's eyes darted to the growing audience before she straightened her spine. I don't appreciate your attitude. As security consultant, it's my job to ensure this building remains safe for everyone. The coded language wasn't subtle. Zora recognized the familiar pattern, her professional demeanor recast as attitude, her presence framed as a threat to safety. I am not a security threat, Zora stated clearly. I am a researcher trying to access my lab. Karen stepped back slightly and raised her phone. I'm calling the police. We have a potential break-in situation at Horizon Tower, 12th floor. Her voice had shifted to a higher register, infused with a tremor that hadn't been present moments before. I don't feel safe. The performance was familiar, the sudden vulnerability, the implication of danger. Zora remained perfectly still, aware that any movement could be misinterpreted, especially once police arrived. The weight in her chest grew heavier. Karen, Marcus finally spoke up, moving closer, phone still recording. I know Dr. Mitchell. She works here. Her lab is right, there with her name on it. Karen glanced at him briefly before turning back to her call. Yes, someone is claiming to be Dr. Mitchell, but I can't verify her identity, and she's refusing to provide additional ID. Please send someone quickly. More doors opened. More witnesses. Zora felt a complex mixture of emotions. Humiliation at being publicly degraded, anger at the injustice, and a bitter relief that at least this time there were witnesses documenting what was happening. The police are on their way, Karen announced, tucking her phone into her blazer pocket. Until they arrive, I'll need you to step away from that door. This is absurd, Zora said quietly. I'm standing outside my own laboratory. Security. Protocols are for everyone's protection, Karen replied with the confidence of someone who believed they occupied the moral high ground. Inclusive Spaces, my consulting firm, specifically trains companies on these matters. Equal application of security measures actually prevents discrimination. The irony might have been comical if it weren't so painful. The woman preventing her from entering her lab owned a diversity consulting firm. Zora could see the corporate logo on Karen's portfolio sitting on a nearby chair, a stylized handshake inside a circle, beneath the words, Inclusive Spaces, Building Equity Through Action. 20 tense minutes passed before the elevator chimed again. Officer James Perkins stepped onto the floor, taking in the scene with a quick, experienced glance. The small crowd of witnesses, Marcus still recording, Karen standing with arms crossed, and Zora, motionless beside her own door. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, addressing the group rather than any individual. Karen stepped forward immediately. "Officer, I'm Karen Whitfield, security consultant. I encountered this woman attempting to access a secure laboratory. After hours and—" "Dr. Zora Mitchell," Zora interrupted calmly, extending her ID badge for inspection. "This is my laboratory. I have badge access and keycard verification. I was prevented from entering to complete urgent research." Officer Perkins nodded slowly, the weariness in his eyes suggesting he understood exactly what kind of situation he'd walked into. "May I see your identification, Dr. Mitchell?" Zora provided both her badge and driver's license. The officer examined them briefly. "And your keycard works on this door?" he asked. "Yes," she responded. "I demonstrated that before being stopped." Officer Perkins turned to Karen. "Ma'am, if her credentials and keycard are valid, what was your concern exactly?" Karen's certainty faltered slightly. "Well, as security consultant, I need to verify everyone's identity. After-hours access requires additional protocols." "Does it?" Officer Perkins asked mildly. "What specific protocol states that employees with valid credentials need additional verification after standard business hours?" As Karen struggled to articulate a policy that didn't exist, Marcus stepped forward. "Officer, I have video of the entire interaction if that helps clarify what happened." Officer Perkins nodded. That might be helpful for everyone's records. His tone carried a subtle emphasis that suggested he recognized the situation for what it was. As the officer verified Zora's employment with building security downstairs, she stood silent, conserving her energy for the research that still awaited her. This incident would cost her at least an hour of valuable work time. The NSF presentation wouldn't wait. What she didn't realize was that Marcus had already sent the video to several colleagues, adding a simple caption. "Watch diversity consultant Karen Whitfield call police on renowned AI researcher Dr. Zora Mitchell for trying to enter her own lab at Horizon Tower." The irony: Karen owns Inclusive Spaces diversity training firm, diversity fraud. By morning, the video would reach millions, forcing a reckoning that would extend far beyond Horizon Tower's glass walls. Officer Perkins had barely left the building when Marcus Chen's thumb hovered over the share button. For 3 years, he'd kept his head down at Meridian Marketing, following his parents' lifetime of advice. Work hard, avoid conflict, success will follow. But tonight, watching Dr. Mitchell stand with perfect composure while being treated like an intruder in her own workspace, something had shifted inside him. If not now, when? He whispered to himself, then pressed share. His phone pinged almost immediately with notifications as colleagues responded. By the time Marcus pulled into his apartment complex, the video had already been shared 327 times. Dr. Zora Mitchell slept dreamlessly after working until 3 a.m. to complete her analysis. The facial recognition algorithm had proven exactly what she suspected: a 34% lower accuracy rate for women with darker skin tones. Her presentation was ready, backed by irrefutable data. She'd set her alarm for 7 a.m., allowing just enough time to dress and reach the NSF panel downtown. The incessant buzzing of her phone finally penetrated her exhaustion at 6:12 a.m. Fumbling in the darkness, she squinted at the screen to find 47 missed calls, 139 text messages, and hundreds of notifications across her social media accounts. The most recent was from her mother. "Call me immediately. You're everywhere online." Zora sat up, fully awake now, and opened Twitter. Her name was trending nationally, alongside Dantius diversity fraud and our Horizon Tower. Marcus's video had reached 1.7 million views overnight and was climbing rapidly. "Oh no," she whispered, watching 12 seconds of footage where Karen called the police while standing directly in front of the door, with Mitchell AI Ethics Lab clearly visible. The irony wasn't lost on viewers, who had quickly discovered and circulated information about Karen's company. As she scrolled through messages, supportive, outraged, opportunistic, Zora's phone lit up with Amelia Richardson's call. "Zora, I just saw the video," Amelia began without preamble, her voice carrying the polished concern of a CEO in crisis management mode. "I'm absolutely appalled by what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Zora replied automatically. The response, practiced through years of navigating professional spaces that treated her presence as exceptional. "But I have my NSF presentation in 2 hours." "Of course your research comes first," Amelia said quickly. "But we should discuss how to handle this situation when you return. The press is already calling our office. I've had 3 reporters camped in the lobby since 6 a.m. Handle this situation." The phrasing wasn't lost on Zora. Not resolve, not address. The discrimination, but handle, contain, manage, minimize. "I'll come by your office after my presentation," Zora said, already calculating how this would impact her day. The research that should have been center stage was now a footnote to a viral confrontation. "Perfect, and Zora, I want you to know that Karen Whitfield does not represent our values at Horizon Tower. This was her first week as a consultant, and I've already suspended her contract pending investigation." The swift action should have felt satisfying, but Zora recognized the corporate playbook. Isolate the problem, remove the visible symptom, avoid examining the underlying condition. "I appreciate that," she replied neutrally. "I need to prepare for my presentation now." After ending the call, Zora allowed herself 5 minutes to scan the online reaction before shutting it all down to focus. She couldn't afford distraction, not when her research could potentially protect millions from algorithmic discrimination. The irony that she'd been racially profiled while researching racial profiling wasn't lost on her. Across town, Karen Whitfield sat in her home office staring at her computer screen in horror. Her social media accounts were flooded with outrage. Her company website had crashed from traffic, and her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Overnight, she had become the internet's main character, and not in a good way. "This is completely unfair," she muttered, scrolling through comments calling for her company to be boycotted. "They're taking a 60-second video completely out of context." The doorbell rang, making her jump. Through the security camera, she saw Vanessa Lopez on her porch, looking uncharacteristically severe. Karen buzzed her in, grateful to see her, chief diversity trainer and most public-facing employee. "Vanessa, thank God. We need damage control immediately. I'm thinking a statement about security protocols and—" "I saw the video," Vanessa interrupted, remaining standing through Karen, had gestured to a chair. "Everyone at the company has seen it. We need to talk about what actually happened, not how to spin it." Karen blinked, unused to being challenged by her employees. "What happened is that I was doing my job as a security consultant, following protocols." Vanessa crossed her arms. "What happened is that you racially profiled a black woman trying to enter her own lab, called the police on her despite multiple forms of identification, and did this while representing a company that charges other organizations thousands of dollars to prevent exactly this kind of incident." The bluntness of the assessment hit Karen like a physical blow. "That's not fair. I would have questioned anyone." "Would you?" Vanessa's voice was quiet but firm. "Because I've reviewed the lobby security footage from yesterday. 3 white employees entered after hours. You nodded at them as they passed." Karen felt her face flush. "That's different. I recognize those people. But you didn't recognize Dr. Zora Mitchell, whose name is literally on the door, who has worked there for 3 years and who is one of the most prominent researchers in the building." Vanessa shook her head. "Do you know what we call that?" "In our own training materials, Karen? Selective enforcement." Before Karen could respond, her laptop chimed with an email notification. The subject line made her stomach drop. "Termination of contract. Inclusive spaces." She clicked it open to find a terse message from Tech Forward, their largest client. In light of recent events highlighting the disconnect between Inclusive Spaces' stated mission and its CEO's actions, Tech Forward is immediately terminating our contract for diversity training services. We cannot in good conscience continue this partnership while maintaining our commitment to creating truly inclusive workplaces. This is insane, Karen whispered, then looked up as her phone began ringing again. One incident, one misunderstanding, and they're ready to destroy everything I've built. Vanessa's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained rigid. Karen, this isn't about destroying you. It's about accountability. You built a company that promises to prevent bias while never addressing your own. That's what people are responding to, the hypocrisy. So what am I supposed to do? Just let my company collapse? Panic was beginning to set in as Karen refreshed her email to find 3 more contract termination notices. You need to respond authentically, Vanessa said, not with corporate language or defensiveness, with genuine reflection. Karen nodded quickly, already reaching for her laptop. You're right, I'll draft something immediately. We'll post it across all platforms. 40 minutes later, Karen published her apology to the company website and social media. Regarding the incident at Horizon Tower, I recognize that my actions were perceived as biased and harmful. As security consultant, I was following established protocols, but I understand how this appeared from Dr. Mitchell's perspective. Inclusive Spaces remains committed to creating equitable environments, and I regret any misunderstanding. We will use this as a learning opportunity to improve our security recommendations moving forward. She sat back, satisfied. There, that addresses it without admitting any legal liability. Vanessa read the statement twice before responding. Karen, this isn't an apology. It's a justification wrapped in corporate language that centers your experience while minimizing the harm you caused. What do you want me to say? Karen snapped, the stress finally breaking through her professional veneer. That I'm a racist? I'm not. I built a diversity company, for God's sake. That's exactly the problem, Vanessa said quietly. You built a diversity company without doing your own work first. You commodified inclusion without practicing it. Before Karen could respond, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Diversity consultant calls police on Black AI researcher. The profitable hypocrisy of corporate inclusion. Attached was a screenshot of her company's financial records showing Inclusive Spaces had generated $4.3 million in revenue the previous year. The backlash to her non-apology was immediate and fierce. Performative allyship began trending alongside taunt diversity fraud. 3 more clients publicly announced they were severing ties with Inclusive Spaces. I need to call my lawyer, Karen murmured, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Marcus Chen stared at his phone in disbelief. His video had reached 2.8 million views and had been picked up by national news outlets. His Twitter followers had jumped from 342 to over 15,000 overnight. He'd received messages from journalists, activists, and even a literary agent, asking if he'd considered writing about being an ally in tech spaces. The attention was dizzying, but also deeply uncomfortable. He hadn't posted the video to become a social media hero. He'd posted it because staying silent felt like complicity. His phone rang with a call from his boss at Meridian Marketing. Marcus, your video has put us at the center of the biggest tech story in months, she began, sounding more impressed than upset. We need to leverage this. Would you be interested in heading up a new initiative on inclusive marketing strategies? The timing couldn't be better. The offer was unexpected, a promotion based on a moment that had nothing to do with his actual work, a career boost built on someone else's humiliation. It felt wrong. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I'd rather not capitalize on what happened to Dr. Mitchell. That wasn't why I shared the video. There was a pause before his boss responded. I understand, but consider this. Your platform could actually help advance the conversation. Think about it, okay? After hanging up, Marcus wrestled with his role in the unfolding drama. He'd wanted accountability, not a viral sensation that was already morphing into something unrecognizable from the actual event. By the time Zora finished her NSF presentation, which had been received with enthusiasm despite several panel members clearly recognizing her from the morning news, 3 different national morning shows had left messages requesting interviews. She returned to Horizon Tower to find the lobby swarming with reporters. Security escorted her through a side entrance directly to Amelia Richardson's top-floor office. "Zora, thank you for coming," Amelia greeted her, gesturing to a sleek conference table where her PR director and legal counsel were already seated. "How did your presentation go?" "They've approved the next phase of funding," Zora replied, taking a seat but declining the offered coffee. "Now, what's this about handling the situation?" Amelia leaned forward, her expression a careful blend of concern and determination. "We want to support you fully. Obviously, Ms. Whitfield's contract has been terminated. We're prepared to issue a public statement condemning her actions and reinforcing our commitment to creating an inclusive environment." The PR director nodded eagerly. "We've drafted language that positions you as a valued member of our community, while highlighting our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." Zora listened to their carefully crafted narrative, one that isolated Karen as a problematic individual, while presenting Horizon Tower as an otherwise perfect meritocracy. It was the same approach she'd seen countless times. Remove the most visible symptom while leaving the underlying disease untreated. "I appreciate the support," she said finally, "but I'm curious. How many other Black women lead research teams in this building?" The question created an uncomfortable silence. "2," Amelia answered eventually, "out of 27 labs. And how are security consultants vetted before being hired? Is bias training part of that process?" The legal counsel cleared his throat. "We typically focus on their security credentials rather than whether they might create hostile environments for certain employees." Zora finished for him. "That's the problem. What happened to me wasn't a Karen Whitfield problem, it was a systemic problem that Karen Whitfield exposed." Amelia's expression tightened slightly. "Zora, we're trying to support you here." "I know, but supporting me means addressing the actual issue, not just issuing statements and removing one person." Zora maintained steady eye contact with the CEO. "I'm not interested in being the face of your crisis management strategy. I'm interested in substantive change." Before Amelia could respond, her assistant entered with an urgent message. "Ms. Whitfield is in the lobby requesting a meeting with both you and Dr. Mitchell. She says it's important." Amelia looked to Zora, who nodded slightly. "Send her up." When Karen entered the conference room, she looked markedly different from the confident security consultant of the previous evening. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture defensive. "Dr. Mitchell," she began stiffly, "I wanted to speak with you directly. My company is imploding. Clients are leaving. My reputation is being destroyed over one interaction. One interaction that revealed a deep problem," Zora replied evenly. Karen took a seat uninvited. "I've drafted a joint statement that might help us both move forward. You acknowledge that I was just following security protocols, and I express regret for any misunderstanding. We could emphasize our shared commitment to improving systems." The proposal was so tone-deaf that for a moment, Zora could only stare, in disbelief. "You're still not understanding what happened, are you?" "What happened is that a 60-second video without context has gone viral," Karen insisted, her voice rising slightly. "People are making assumptions without knowing." "I think the video had plenty of context," interrupted a new voice from the doorway. Vanessa Lopez stood there, holding a tablet. The laboratory name visible on the door, the ID badge, the functioning keycard, the multiple witnesses confirming Dr. Mitchell's identity. Karen turned, visibly startled. "Vanessa, what are you doing here?" "I came to offer an alternative perspective," Vanessa replied, addressing her words to both Amelia and Zora. "As Inclusive Space's chief diversity trainer, I believe there's an opportunity here for genuine transformation rather than damage control, if everyone is willing to engage honestly." Amelia studied Vanessa with new interest. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A restorative process," Vanessa explained. "Not a joint statement or press conference, but a structured dialogue that addresses the actual harm done and the systems that enabled it." Karen looked from Vanessa to Amelia in disbelief. "This is absurd. We don't need a process. We need to manage this PR crisis before it destroys both our reputations." Your reputation is being damaged because your actions contradicted your stated values, Zora observed quietly. That's not a PR problem, it's an integrity problem. The tension in the room was palpable when another knock came at the door. Marcus Chen stood awkwardly in the threshold. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Security called me up. I thought I should be part of this conversation since I'm the one who posted the video. Amelia gestured him in, a calculating look crossing her face. Actually, having everyone involved might be useful. Ms. Lopez, you mentioned a restorative process? Perhaps that could include all parties affected by the incident. Zora recognized Amelia's pivot, from damage control to potential opportunity. It was a CEO's instinct to find advantage in crisis. Still, the suggestion had merit, especially compared to the alternatives. I'd be willing to participate in a properly structured process, Zora said carefully, but not one designed primarily to protect reputations or avoid accountability. This is ridiculous, Karen protested. My company is hemorrhaging clients by the minute. I don't have time for some extended kumbaya session. Vanessa turned to her former boss with unexpected compassion. Karen, your company is in crisis precisely because it promoted diversity work it wasn't actually practicing. This process might be your only path forward. As Karen's resistance wavered in the face of this reality, Amelia seized the moment. Then it's settled. We'll arrange a facilitated dialogue with all relevant parties. In the meantime, we issue only a brief statement acknowledging that an incident occurred and that we're committed to addressing it substantively rather than superficially. The proposed solution was imperfect, but it offered something rare in these situations: the possibility of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. Zora found herself cautiously optimistic, though experience had taught her to temper such feelings. As the impromptu meeting dispersed, Marcus approached Zora hesitantly. Dr. Mitchell, I wanted to apologize if posting that video made things harder for you. I just couldn't stay silent, but I never expected it to explode like this. Zora studied the young man whose decision had transformed a private humiliation into a public reckoning. Don't apologize for bearing witness, Mr. Chen. History needs its documentation, uncomfortable as that may be for everyone involved. She gathered her belongings and headed for her laboratory, where the real work, the research that might help prevent algorithmic bias from perpetuating the very prejudices she'd experienced, awaited her attention. The viral storm would continue to rage, but she would not allow it to define her or distract from her purpose. Behind her, Vanessa and Karen remained in tense conversation, while Amelia already worked her phone to locate a suitable restorative justice facilitator. The foundations were being laid for what would either become a meaningful transformation or another exercise in performative change. Only time would reveal which path they would ultimately choose. 3 days after the confrontation, Horizon Tower had transformed. Security guards flanked the main entrance. News vans lined the perimeter and protesters gathered with signs reading, "No place for Karen in STEM," and "Diversity isn't a business, it's justice." Dr. Zora Mitchell entered through the loading dock, escorted by security. The backdoor route had become necessary after being mobbed by journalists the previous day. Her phone remained off for hours at a time, the only way to focus on her research amid the storm of attention. At 10 a.m., she stepped into Amelia Richardson's executive conference room. The space embodied Silicon Valley minimalism, a gleaming white table, ergonomic chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Seattle's skyline. Amelia stood as Zora entered, projecting confidence in her tailored navy suit. Dr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I hope the private entrance worked better for you. Karen Whitfield sat rigidly at the far end, eyes fixed on a leather portfolio. She'd aged years in 3 days. Hair pulled back severely, minimal makeup that couldn't conceal her exhaustion. She didn't look up when Zora entered. I believe you know everyone here, Amelia continued, gesturing to her PR director and legal counsel. We're still waiting for Mr. Chen, who confirmed he would join us. Zora took a seat directly across from Karen. I've invited someone else as well. I hope that won't be a problem. Amelia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course not. The more perspectives, the better. Marcus Chen entered in a button-down shirt and slacks, a visual signal of the gravity with which he viewed the meeting. He nodded respectfully to Zora before taking a seat. Now that we're all here, Amelia began, sliding folders toward each person, I've prepared some thoughts on how we might resolve this situation productively. Zora left her folder closed. You mentioned we're all here, but we're still missing someone. The door opened again. Vanessa Lopez entered in a bright red blazer, her presence commanding immediate attention. Karen's head snapped up, her expression cycling from surprise to betrayal. Vanessa? What are you doing here? Karen's voice cracked slightly. Dr. Mitchell invited me. Vanessa replied calmly, taking the seat beside Zora. Given my role at Inclusive Spaces and my expertise in authentic diversity work, my perspective seemed relevant. Karen's jaw tightened. Role, you resigned yesterday. Which gives me even more freedom to speak honestly, Vanessa countered. Amelia quickly recalibrated. Ms. Lopez, welcome. As I was saying, I've prepared a framework for moving forward. Inside the folders was a draft joint statement, a confidentiality agreement, and a bullet-pointed list titled, Action Steps for Inclusive Excellence. After consulting with our communications team and legal department, we believe the most productive approach is a unified response, Amelia explained, turning to a screen where the draft statement appeared. Horizon Tower, Inclusive Spaces, and Dr. Zora Mitchell acknowledge that a security misunderstanding occurred on March 3rd. We recognize the heightened sensitivities around issues of belonging and access. Rather than dwelling on a single incident, we are committed to working together to enhance our security protocols while ensuring all community members feel welcomed and valued. We ask for privacy as we engage in this important work together. Zora read it twice. This isn't acceptable, Amelia blinked. We're open to revisions, of course. It's not about wording, Zora interrupted. It's about framing. This wasn't a misunderstanding or unfortunate incident. It was racial profiling, performed by someone who profits from teaching others not to racially profile. Karen's hands clenched into fists. That's not fair. I was doing my job as a security consultant. Anyone entering after hours. 3 white employees entered after you began your shift, Zora cut in. Security footage shows you nodding to them as they passed. Only I was stopped. Only I was asked for multiple forms of identification. Only I had the police called on me. The room fell silent. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I realize how this appears, Karen said finally, her voice strained. But my intentions weren't. This isn't about your intentions, Vanessa interjected. It's about impact. The harm happened regardless of what you meant to do. Karen turned to her former employee, color rising in her cheeks. Vanessa, you know me. You know I've dedicated my career to diversity work. How can you sit there and imply I'm racist? I'm not implying anything, Vanessa replied evenly. I'm stating that your actions showed bias, regardless of your intentions or self-perception. And when confronted with that reality, your response has been to defend rather than reflect. Karen's composure finally cracked. Because my entire company is collapsing. I've lost 7 major clients in 3 days. My reputation is in shambles. All because of a 60-second interaction that's been completely blown out of proportion. Ms. Whitfield, Marcus spoke up unexpectedly, his voice quiet but firm. I recorded that video because what I witnessed wasn't a misunderstanding. It was wrong. I've spent too much of my life staying silent when I should have spoken up. Karen turned to him, desperation edging into her voice. Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? To everything I've built? What about what you did to Dr. Mitchell? Marcus countered. You called the police on her for trying to enter her own laboratory. Do you understand what could have happened? Everyone, please, Amelia interrupted. Assigning blame isn't productive. We need solutions that allow all parties to move forward with dignity. Zora leaned forward. Amelia, you keep framing this as if all parties bear equal responsibility. We don't. I was doing my job. Ms. Whitfield was preventing me from doing my job based on biased assumptions. Those are not equivalent positions. The PR director cleared his throat. Dr. Mitchell, we understand your frustration, but from a communication standpoint, a joint statement presents everyone as problem solvers rather than what?
Victims, perpetrators? Zora's voice remained measured despite her growing frustration. The problem with your approach is that it prioritizes optics over actual change. It's precisely this kind of superficial response that allows these incidents
to keep happening. Karen slammed her hand on the table. Superficial, I've lost nearly everything. My company is imploding. My reputation is destroyed, and you're talking as if nothing has happened to me. Those are consequences, not injustices, Vanessa observed quietly. The statement hung in the air. Karen stared at her former employee, momentarily speechless. Amelia attempted to steer the conversation back. The action steps I've outlined include enhanced security training, a review of after-hours access protocols, and the creation of a diversity task force. Chaired by whom? Zora interrupted. Implemented how? Accountable to what metrics? These aren't new ideas, Amelia. They're the same solutions trotted out after every incident, designed to create the appearance of action without fundamentally changing anything. Amelia's CEO Polish showed cracks. What exactly do you want, Zora? A public flogging? Ms. Whitfield's complete professional destruction? How does that create positive change? I want accountability that leads to transformation, Zora replied simply. Not performative statements, not superficial training, not task forces that meet quarterly to produce reports no one reads. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder, a reminder of the public pressure surrounding their private discussion. Karen's voice was barely audible. What would meaningful accountability look like to you? The question, the first genuine one Karen had asked, shifted the energy in the room. Zora studied her before responding. It would start with you acknowledging what actually happened, not what you wish had happened or what you intended to happen. It would include examining the gap between what your company claims to do and what you yourself practice. And it would require a commitment to repair, not just to yourself or your company, but to the communities harmed by the attitudes your actions reflected. Karen swallowed hard. And if I did all that, would it be enough? Would people forgive me? That's not for me to say, Zora answered honestly. Forgiveness isn't something you're entitled to, nor is it something I can grant on behalf of everyone affected. What I can say is that genuine accountability is the only path forward with integrity. Amelia attempted to recenter the discussion. These are all important considerations. Perhaps we need a more structured framework. The framework isn't the problem, Vanessa interjected. The problem is that we're approaching this as if it's primarily a PR crisis, rather than a moment that reveals deeper truths about how our organizations operate. Marcus nodded. What happened to Dr. Mitchell isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern that repeats because organizations like ours treat diversity as a marketing strategy rather than a core value. Karen looked up sharply. That's not fair. My company has helped dozens of organizations implement meaningful diversity initiatives. Has it? Vanessa challenged. Or has it helped them implement the appearance of diversity initiatives? Because those are very different things. The question hung in the air. Karen's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I believed in the work we were doing, she said finally, her voice small. I know, Vanessa replied, her tone softening. That's what makes this so difficult. But believing in diversity work while failing to confront your own biases is exactly the contradiction that led to this moment. Amelia glanced at her watch. We've been talking for nearly 2 hours without reaching consensus. Perhaps we should adjourn. No, Zora said firmly. Adjourning without a path forward just delays the necessary work. If we're not ready for a joint statement or public resolution, that's fine. But I need to know what happens next. The room fell silent. It was Marcus who eventually spoke. What if we brought in someone external? a professional facilitator who specializes in restorative practices. He looked around uncertainly. My cousin went through a restorative justice process after a community conflict. It wasn't easy, but it was real. Not just about making the problem go away, but about understanding it and creating actual change. Vanessa nodded. A structured restorative process could provide a framework for the kind of accountability Dr. Mitchell is describing. Karen looked dubious. What would that even involve? Facilitated dialogues, deeper examination of what happened and why, development of concrete steps for repair and prevention, Vanessa explained. It's challenging work, but ultimately more meaningful than press releases or diversity task forces. Amelia studied each face. A private, facilitated process could allow for authentic resolution while managing public perception. If all parties agreed to participate in good faith, I would consider it, Zora said carefully, depending on the facilitator and the structure. All eyes turned to Karen, who sat motionless before responding. I don't see what choice I have at this point. Her defeated tone revealed how little she understood what was being offered. Not just a path to reputation repair, but an opportunity for genuine transformation. Then we have a direction, Amelia concluded. My team will research appropriate facilitators with experience in corporate settings. I'd like input on that selection, Zora stated. It wasn't a request. Amelia nodded. Of course. We'll compile options for everyone's review. As the meeting dispersed, Karen remained seated, staring at her hands. Zora paused at the door before approaching. Ms. Whitfield, she said quietly. Karen looked up, eyes red-rimmed but dry. This process will only work if you're willing to engage with uncomfortable truths, Zora continued. Not just about what happened that night, but about the contradictions in your work and life that made it possible. Karen's laugh was hollow. You think I haven't been uncomfortable? My life is imploding. There's a difference between discomfort from consequences and discomfort from growth, Zora replied. One is something that happens to you. The other is something you choose. With that, she turned and left, Marcus falling into step beside her. Vanessa lingered, watching her former employer. You know what the hardest part of this will be for you, Karen? Vanessa asked gently. Karen looked up. Exhaustion etched into her features. What? Accepting that your intent doesn't matter as much as you think it does, that you can cause harm even when you didn't mean to, that your self-perception as a good person isn't the same as actually doing good. How did you figure all this out? Karen asked, genuine curiosity breaking through her defensiveness. Vanessa smiled sadly. By messing up, being called in, and choosing to listen rather than defend, it's a process that never really ends. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person, Karen. I think you're someone who built a business around work you hadn't yet done yourself. This could be your opportunity to finally do that work. Left alone, Karen stared at the protesters below. One sign caught her eye. Performative diversity is violence. 6 months ago, she might have quoted that in a corporate training. Now, it felt like an indictment of everything she'd built. Her phone buzzed with another client termination email. She didn't bother opening it. As Zora walked back to her laboratory, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Dr. Mitchell, this is Maya Jefferson from the Civil Liberties Law Center. I've been following what happened at Horizon Tower, and I believe we could build a strong discrimination case if you're interested in pursuing legal action. Zora paused in the hallway. Thank you for reaching out, Ms. Jefferson. I'm exploring various options at the moment. Of course. Just so you know, incidents like these often settle quickly when there's clear documentation. The video makes your position particularly strong. The attorney's words lingered as Zora entered her lab. A lawsuit would create a different kind of accountability, public, financial, legally binding. It would send a message. But would it create the kind of transformation she was seeking? She settled at her desk and opened her browser, typing Restorative Justice Corporate Settings into the search bar. As results populated her screen, she began to research an alternative path, one that might demand more from everyone involved, but potentially offer something lawsuits rarely provided: genuine understanding and lasting change. The choice ahead wasn't simple. Legal action offered clear penalties and public accountability. Restorative justice offered the harder, more uncertain path of transformation. As the founder of a lab dedicated to making algorithms more ethical, Zora knew that the most straightforward solution wasn't always the most effective one. Her decision would shape not just the resolution of this incident, but potentially how similar conflicts might be addressed in the future. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she continued her research, determined to find a path that served justice rather than merely the appearance of it. 1 week after the incident, Dr. Zora Mitchell sat in a downtown law office, watching attorney Maya Jefferson review the case materials with methodical precision. Outside the window, Seattle's perpetual drizzle created a gray backdrop that matched her mood. "The evidence couldn't be stronger," Maya said, placing a tablet with Marcus's video queued up between them. "Clear documentation of discriminatory treatment, multiple witnesses, undeniable professional credentials, and public admission by Horizon Tower that the security protocols were selectively enforced." Zora nodded but remained silent. The legal path lay clearly before her, a discrimination lawsuit that Maya predicted would settle quickly and substantially. Yet something held her back. "You could direct a portion of the settlement toward your research," Maya continued, sensing her hesitation. "Many clients find that channeling compensation into meaningful work helps transform a painful experience into something productive." "It's not about the money," Zora said quietly. Maya leaned back in her chair. "Then what is it about for you?" It was a deceptively simple question. Zora had asked herself the same thing repeatedly over the past week, as she'd navigated back to her laboratory daily through side entrances, fielded interview requests from major publications, and tried to maintain focus on her research despite the swirling controversy. "I want something to change," she finally answered. "Not just for me, not just at Horizon Tower, but in the way these incidents are understood and addressed. Filing a lawsuit might create consequences for Karen Whitfield and financial liability for the building, but will it prevent the next incident? Litigation creates precedent," Maya pointed out. "Financial penalties motivate institutional change, and your case could establish important standards for security practices in mixed-use facilities." Zora knew the attorney was right, yet the nagging feeling persisted. "I've spent my career developing algorithms that can identify subtle patterns of bias. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now caught in a very human version of the same problem." Maya's expression softened. "Dr. Mitchell, choosing legal action doesn't preclude other forms of resolution. You can pursue both accountability and education simultaneously." "Maybe," Zora conceded, "but I need more time to consider all options." As she gathered her things to leave, Maya handed her a business card. "The statute of limitations gives you time, but evidence and public interest are strongest now. Whatever you decide, we're ready to move forward when you are." Zora slipped the card into her bag before stepping back into the rain, contemplating the weight of her decision, not just for herself, but for how these incidents would be addressed in the future. Across town, Karen Whitfield sat alone in Inclusive Spaces conference room, surrounded by empty chairs. The company that had once bustled with 27 employees now operated with a skeleton crew of 5. The exodus had begun with Vanessa's resignation and accelerated as clients fled. The Bloomberg News segment playing on her laptop twisted the knife deeper. TechNexus, a leading AI development firm valued at $3.2 billion, has publicly terminated their contract with Inclusive Spaces during this morning's quarterly earnings call, the reporter announced. CEO Rajiv Mehta stated that the decision was made to align with the company's core values of authenticity and inclusion. This marks the 18th major client to sever ties with the diversity consulting firm since its founder, Karen Whitfield, was caught on video racially profiling AI researcher Dr. Zora Mitchell. Karen closed the laptop with more force than necessary. TechNexus had been their anchor client, providing nearly 30% of annual revenue. Their diversity training package had been Inclusive Space's flagship program, showcased prominently in marketing materials and case studies, all gone in a 7-minute segment during an earnings call. She moved to the window overlooking Elliott Bay, where ferries cut white paths through steel-gray water. The view had once filled her with pride, the corner office representing her, success in a competitive market. Now it felt like a glass cage where she remained exposed to public scrutiny. Her phone chimed with a calendar reminder. Crisis Management Strategy, 2 p.m. The PR firm she'd hired was scheduled to present their approach for rehabilitating her image. The preliminary materials had included phrases like misunderstanding narrative and diversity champion under fire. For the first time, these phrases struck her as hollow, even dishonest. Was that how she truly saw what had happened? A misunderstanding? An unfair attack on a diversity champion? Karen found herself replaying the confrontation with Dr. Mitchell, not as she'd described it to others, but as it had actually unfolded. The white employees she'd nodded to without stopping. The immediate suspicion upon seeing a black woman. The escalation to police despite multiple forms of identification. What was I actually afraid of? She whispered to herself, the question emerging unbidden. The answer didn't come easily, but when it did, it carried the sting of truth. She hadn't been afraid. She'd been exercising power, the authority to question, to challenge, to determine who belonged and who didn't.
The realization brought no relief, only a deeper discomfort that couldn't be managed away by crisis consultants or carefully worded statements. She reached for her phone to cancel the PR meeting, then hesitated. Without a strategy, what was left?
Without inclusive spaces, who was she? The questions lingered, unanswered, as she turned back to the window where rain now obscured the view entirely. The data visualization needs to be absolutely clear, Zora instructed her research team gathered. In the Mitchell AI Ethics Lab, the facial recognition discrepancies must be immediately apparent even to non-technical audiences. Her team nodded, making notes and adjusting parameters on their screens. The expanded research grant from the National Science Foundation had allowed Zora to hire 2 additional postdocs, a significant achievement that should have been her focus this week. Instead, it had become increasingly difficult to separate her professional work from her personal experience. The algorithms they were analyzing had failed to recognize darker-skinned faces at significantly higher rates than lighter ones. The system had looked at her and determined she didn't belong, couldn't be recognized, wasn't worthy of the same processing. How different was that from what Karen Whitfield had done? A knock at the laboratory door interrupted her thoughts. Officer, James Perkins stood in the hallway, out of uniform in jeans and a button-down shirt. Dr. Mitchell, he said, extending his hand. I hope I'm not interrupting. I called earlier about stopping by. Zora nodded, leading him to a small conference area separated from the main laboratory. Thank you for coming, Officer Perkins. I appreciate you making time. James, please. He settled into a chair, his demeanor more relaxed than during their first encounter. I've been thinking a lot about what happened that night. Your attorney reached out for my statement, and I wanted to speak with you directly as well. You've provided a statement already? Zora asked, surprised. I have. It confirms exactly what the video shows. Selective enforcement of security protocols based on obvious bias. His directness was refreshing after a week of carefully worded corporate communications. I've responded to these calls for 20 years, Dr. Mitchell. The pattern is sadly familiar. Zora studied him with new interest. What made you decide to provide a statement voluntarily? Because nothing changes if we don't speak up, he replied simply. Ms. Whitfield isn't the first person to weaponize police presence against someone who has every right to be where they are. But accountability only happens when those with authority acknowledge the problem. His words resonated deeply with Zora's own thinking. Have you ever been part of a restorative justice process, Officer James? He nodded. Several times, actually. Our department has a pilot program for certain community conflicts. When done right, it can be transformative in a way that punitive measures rarely achieve. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with James sharing insights from his
experience that added yet another dimension to Zora's consideration of how to proceed.
After he left, Zora returned to her office to find an email from the NSF program officer. Dr. Mitchell, while your research continues to receive high praise from the review committee, concerns have been raised about the recent publicity surrounding your work. Several board members have expressed worry that the controversy might overshadow the scientific contributions of the project. I remain personally committed to your research objectives and would welcome the opportunity to discuss strategies for ensuring continued funding in this challenging environment. Regards, Dr. Eleanor Winters, Program Director, AI Ethics Initiative. Zora stared at the screen, a familiar weariness settling over her. Once again, her work was being evaluated not purely on its merits, but through the lens of a controversy she hadn't created. The research that could potentially protect millions from algorithmic discrimination was now itself at risk because she'd been discriminated against. The irony would have been almost comical if it weren't so exhausting. Marcus Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his director outlined the proposal. Head of Communications is a significant promotion, Marcus. Your handling of the video situation demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and ethical awareness we value at Meridian Marketing. I appreciate the vote of confidence, Marcus replied carefully, but I'm not sure leveraging this situation for career advancement feels right. His director leaned forward, her expression earnest. This isn't about leveraging a situation. It's about recognizing that you demonstrated core values we want in leadership, speaking truth to power, documenting injustice, using media responsibly. Marcus couldn't deny the opportunity was appealing. The promotion meant a substantial salary, increase, greater creative control, and a seat at the executive table, achievements that typically required years of careful positioning. Yet the path felt uncomfortably opportunistic. Can I have some time to consider the offer? He asked. Of course. But don't overthink this, Marcus. You did the right thing, and good things are coming from it. That's how it should work. As he left the meeting, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Marcus, this is Vanessa Lopez, formerly of Inclusive Spaces. I got your contact from Dr. Mitchell. Do you have time to discuss an idea related to what happened last week? I think your perspective would be valuable. The message presented both a complication and potentially a clarification. Was this another opportunity arising from his viral video, or something more substantive? I can meet this afternoon, he replied. Curious about what Vanessa might propose. The cafe near Pike Place Market offered enough ambient noise to ensure privacy, while remaining public enough for professional comfort. Vanessa had arrived early, reviewing notes on her tablet when Zora entered. Thank you for making time, Vanessa said as Zora settled across from her. I know you're being pulled in multiple directions right now. Including by attorneys, Zora acknowledged with a small smile. But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Vanessa took a deep breath. I've spent 5 years at Inclusive Spaces, believing we were making meaningful change in corporate environments. What happened with you forced me to confront the gap between what we claimed to do and what we actually accomplished. Which was? Performance, Vanessa said bluntly. We helped companies perform diversity without fundamentally changing their cultures or practices. We created metrics that looked impressive in annual reports without addressing underlying biases. We commodified inclusion. Her honesty was striking, particularly coming from someone who had sacrificed her own livelihood to maintain her integrity. After resigning, I've been developing an alternative approach, Vanessa continued, sliding her tablet toward Zora. Not just training, but a complete case study and methodology based on what happened at Horizon Tower, if you're willing to participate. Zora reviewed the outline on the screen. Beyond performance, transforming corporate culture through authentic accountability. The proposal outlined a multi-stage process involving structured dialogue, historical analysis of systemic bias, development of concrete action steps, and ongoing accountability measures. This isn't just about Karen, is it? Zora asked, looking up from the tablet. No, Vanessa confirmed. It's about the entire ecosystem that made what happened possible. from security procedures that allow for selective enforcement to corporate diversity initiatives that prioritize appearance over substance. The proposal aligned remarkably well with Zora's own thinking, yet questions remained. Why would Karen agree to this? Her instinct so far has been damage control, not genuine reflection. Because she's running out of options, Vanessa replied, simply. Her company is imploding. Traditional PR isn't working. This offers a path forward, though not an easy one. Zora considered this. And Amelia Richardson? Horizon Tower? They need a resolution that goes beyond press releases. The protesters aren't leaving. The media attention isn't fading, and other companies are watching how they handle this. Vanessa leaned forward. But most importantly, this approach creates something lasting, a framework for addressing similar
incidents that focuses on transformation rather than just consequences. As they continued discussing details, Marcus arrived, greeting them both with cautious optimism. His perspective as both witness and now potential beneficiary of the incident
added yet another dimension to the complex situation. I've been offered a promotion, he admitted, explaining his discomfort with advancing professionally from documenting someone else's painful experience. The question isn't whether you benefit, Zora observed. It's whether you use that benefit responsibly. Platforms and positions matter. What will you do with yours? The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, the three of them developing a vision for a process that might create genuine change rather than just temporary consequences or performative solutions. As they prepared to leave, Zora's phone buzzed, with a news alert from TechCrunch. Breaking security while black. Investigative report reveals pattern of discriminatory security practices across tech industry. The article detailed dozens of incidents similar to what Zora had experienced, presenting data on the disproportionate questioning, escorting, and reporting of black and brown employees in technology workplaces nationwide. Horizon Tower was mentioned specifically, but as just one example of a widespread problem. It's bigger than just what happened to me, Zora murmured, passing her phone so the others could read the article. It always was, Vanessa replied quietly. The question is whether this becomes another outrage cycle that fades without impact, or a catalyst for genuine change. The article's final paragraph seemed to be addressing them directly. While individual incidents often generate temporary, outrage-lasting transformation requires more than viral videos and public shaming. The tech industry stands at a crossroads. Continue treating diversity as a marketing strategy, or begin the harder work of creating truly inclusive environments through sustained, substantive action. Zora looked up from the screen, her decision crystallizing. The choice between legal action and restorative justice had initially seemed binary, but perhaps there was a third path, one that combined accountability with transformation, consequences with education. I need to make some calls, she said, a new resolve in her voice. Starting with my attorney, and then Amelia Richardson. The path forward remained uncertain, but the destination had become clearer. Not just resolution of a single incident,
but creation of a framework that might prevent countless others.
It would be difficult, messy, and imperfect. Real change always was. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Horizon Tower, Dr. Zora Mitchell sat in her apartment surrounded by papers spread across her dining table, legal documents on one side, research materials on the other, the physical manifestation of the choice before her. The lawsuit paperwork waited for her signature. Maya Jefferson had called that morning to inform her that everything was prepared for filing. The case is exceptionally strong, she'd said. With the video evidence and Officer Perkins's statement, we're in an ideal position to move forward.
The financial settlement would likely be substantial. Beyond compensation, the legal action would create a public record documenting exactly what had happened, not a misunderstanding or unfortunate incident, but racial profiling with clear
consequences. There was power in that formal acknowledgement, in the precedent it would establish. Yet beside the legal documents lay another set of papers, Vanessa's proposal for a structured restorative process, now expanded into a comprehensive framework. This approach offered something a lawsuit couldn't, the potential for genuine transformation, not just for the individuals involved, but potentially for the broader tech industry. Zora's phone buzzed with a text from Amelia Richardson. Meeting arranged with Dr. Imani Washington, Restorative Justice Facilitator. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. All key parties confirmed attendance. Please advise if you'll join us. Dr. Washington's name was familiar. A respected practitioner whose work bridged corporate environments and community settings, known for her uncompromising approach to accountability within restorative frameworks. Her involvement suggested Amelia was taking this approach seriously, not merely seeking a quick public relations fix. Before Zora could respond, another notification appeared, an email from Karen Whitfield. Her finger hovered over the delete button before curiosity won out. Dr. Mitchell, I've written and deleted this email a dozen times over the past week. Nothing I say can undo what happened, and I understand if you choose not to read this at all. The easy path would be to blame circumstances, the new security contract, the late hour, the protocols I was following. I've tried that approach in public statements, and even as I said those words, I recognized their hollowness. The truth is simpler and harder to admit. I saw you and made immediate assumptions. I exercised authority I shouldn't have, motivated by biases I've never fully examined, despite building an entire company around helping others examine theirs. I'm not asking for forgiveness or absolution. I'm not expecting this message to change your decision about legal action, which is entirely your right to pursue. I simply needed to acknowledge the truth, to you and to myself, about what actually happened that night. If you choose to proceed with the restorative justice process Dr. Washington has proposed, I will participate with complete honesty, regardless of how uncomfortable that becomes. If you choose the legal path instead, I will not contest the facts or attempt to minimize my responsibility. Karen Whitfield. Zora read the message twice, searching for the corporate language and carefully constructed non-apology that had characterized Karen's previous statements. Instead, she found something unexpected, the first signs of genuine reflection, rather than strategic positioning. It wasn't transformative by itself, but it suggested potential for the kind of growth that might actually create meaningful change. The question remained whether that potential justified the additional emotional labor that a restorative process would require of her. Her phone rang again, Maya Jefferson calling for her decision on the lawsuit. I need until tomorrow, Zora told her attorney. After the meeting with Dr. Washington, I'll know which path I'm choosing. Understood, Maya replied. But remember what we discussed. These two approaches aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
A settlement could fund broader initiatives while the restorative process addresses the personal and systemic issues. The possibility of both, and rather than either or, had been increasingly on Zora's mind. Perhaps the choice wasn't as binary as it had initially seemed. Horizon Tower's media room had been transformed into a neutral space for the preliminary meeting with Dr. Imani Washington. The executive furniture had been replaced with a circular arrangement of comfortable chairs. The corporate artwork had been removed, leaving bare walls. Even the lighting had been adjusted from the usual harsh fluorescents to softer, warmer lamps. Amelia Richardson waited nervously by the door, checking her watch repeatedly. Dr. Washington was very specific about the environment, she explained, when Zora arrived. Something about creating psychological safety through physical space. Zora nodded, noting the care that had been taken. It's a good sign that you followed her guidance exactly. I want this to work, Amelia admitted, surprising Zora with her candor. Not just for the obvious reasons, the protesters, the media, attention, the potential liability, but because I've spent the past 2 weeks learning about the experiences of our black and brown employees. The stories I've heard. She shook her head. Your incident wasn't an anomaly. It was just the one that finally got documented. Before Zora could respond, Marcus Chen arrived, followed shortly by Officer Perkins and Vanessa Lopez. The group exchanged tentative greetings, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Has anyone heard from Karen? Zora asked, noticing her absence as the scheduled time approached. She confirmed yesterday, Amelia replied, her concern evident. But she hasn't responded to messages this morning. As if summoned by the conversation,
The elevator doors opened to reveal Karen Whitfield. She appeared markedly different from their previous encounters, her typical polished corporate appearance replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back without artifice. She carried nothing but a small notebook. "I'm sorry if I'm late," she said quietly, taking the remaining empty chair without making eye contact with anyone. The final arrival was Dr. Imani Washington, a statuesque woman in her 60s, whose presence immediately commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a vibrant blue dress and carried a well-worn leather portfolio. Her silver locks were gathered in an elegant updo, and she wore no jewelry except for simple wooden earrings. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice warm but authoritative. "I recognize the courage it takes to engage in this kind of process, particularly when other options might seem simpler or more familiar." She took a seat, completing the circle, and placed her portfolio on her lap without opening it. "Before outlining what a restorative process would involve, I want to be clear about what it is not. It is not a faster way to achieve reconciliation without accountability. It is not a means of avoiding consequences. It is not a performance of healing for public consumption." Her gaze moved deliberately around the circle, making brief but meaningful eye contact with each person. Restorative justice requires more, not less, from all participants than conventional approaches. It demands complete honesty, willingness to experience discomfort, and commitment to transformation rather than mere resolution. Zora found herself nodding slightly, appreciating the directness. "The process I facilitate has 3 phases," Dr. Washington continued. "Truth-telling, in which each person shares their complete experience without interruption or defense. Acknowledgement, in which the impact of actions is fully recognized and accepted by those responsible. And transformation, in which specific steps are developed to repair harm and prevent recurrence." She leaned forward slightly. "If anyone is seeking a quick fix or an easy way to move past this incident without fundamentally changing, this is not the right process for you." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair but remained silent. "Do you have questions about how this would work specifically?" Dr. Washington asked, opening the floor. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "What's the timeline?" Amelia inquired. "How many sessions, over what period?" "Typically 6 to 8 sessions over 3 months, Dr. Washington replied. "This isn't a weekend workshop or corporate retreat. Real transformation takes time." "What about confidentiality?" Marcus asked. "Would we be allowed to discuss the process publicly?" "I recommend a shared agreement about external communication," Dr. Washington explained. "Not secrecy, but thoughtfulness about how and when you share elements of the process. Performative updates can undermine authentic work." "And the outcome?" Zora asked the question that had been foremost in her mind. "What concrete changes would result beyond personal growth?" Dr. Washington smiled appreciatively at the question. "The final phase focuses specifically on actionable commitments, changes to security protocols, new approaches to diversity initiatives, structural adjustments that address root causes rather than just symptoms. These would be formalized in writing, with clear accountability mechanisms and timelines." She paused, letting the information settle before continuing. "But I want to be clear about something else. This process doesn't preclude other forms of accountability. Legal action and restorative justice can run parallel tracks, addressing different dimensions of harm and repair." The observation aligned perfectly with Zora's evolving thinking. Perhaps the question wasn't which path to choose, but how to integrate multiple approaches to create the most meaningful impact. As the discussion continued, Zora noticed Karen becoming increasingly withdrawn, her initial discomfort evolving into visible distress. "Ms. Whitfield," Dr. Washington said gently, "you've been very quiet. What are you thinking about this process?" Karen looked up, her expression raw with emotion she was struggling to contain. "I'm thinking that I built a career helping companies appear more diverse and inclusive without ever really confronting my own biases. I'm thinking about how much easier it would be to just let my company fail and walk away than to actually do this work? She paused, taking a shaky breath. And I'm wondering if I have the courage to face not just what I did that night, but what it reveals about who I've been all along. The honesty was unexpected, creating a momentary silence in the room. That's precisely the kind of reflection this process requires, Dr. Washington acknowledged. It isn't comfortable, but it is necessary. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Washington provided materials for everyone to review before making their final decisions about participation. Take 48 hours, she advised. Consult with your attorneys, your loved ones, your own moral compass. This process only works if everyone enters it with complete commitment. The group dispersed, each person carrying the weight of their impending decision. Zora was gathering her things when Vanessa approached. I wanted you to know that I've accepted a position with Authentic Inclusion Collaborative, she said. It's a smaller firm, but one that approaches diversity work from a justice rather than corporate compliance perspective. Congratulations, Zora replied sincerely. That sounds like a better fit for your values. Vanessa nodded. It is. But I've negotiated to have time for this process, if you decide to move forward with it. I believe what we create here could become a model for addressing similar incidents throughout the industry. Her commitment was impressive, particularly given that she had the least direct involvement in the incident, yet was willing to invest substantial time in its resolution. As Zora left the building, she checked her email to find a message from a prominent venture capital firm specializing in AI ethics applications. Dr. Mitchell, we've been following your research on algorithmic bias in facial recognition systems.
With great interest. The implications for both technology development and social justice align perfectly with our investment priorities for the coming year.
We would be interested in discussing potential funding for commercialization of your research, contingent upon successful resolution of the current situation at Horizon Tower. While we understand the complexity involved, our investment committee has expressed concern about associating with ongoing controversy. Please let us know when circumstances have stabilized, as we're eager to explore this opportunity further. Regards, Eliza Martinson, Partner, Equitable Future Ventures. The message represented both opportunity and frustration. Recognition of her work's value coupled with the familiar pressure to resolve a situation she hadn't created quickly and quietly. The controversy continued to overshadow her research, despite its potential to prevent algorithmic discrimination for millions. Her phone buzzed with a notification from Medium, where Marcus had just published an essay titled, From Bystander to Witness, What I Learned About Allyship When My Video Went Viral. The piece had already gained significant traction, with comments and shares multiplying by the minute. She began reading. When I pressed record on my phone that night, I wasn't thinking about becoming an ally or creating a viral moment. I was simply documenting something wrong happening in front of me. What I've learned since then is that allyship isn't an identity you claim. It's a continuous practice of action, reflection, and accountability.
The essay continued thoughtfully, exploring the discomfort Marcus had felt about benefiting professionally from documenting harm done to someone else, and how he'd ultimately decided to use his expanded platform to address systemic issues rather than center his own experience. It was a remarkably nuanced perspective, particularly from someone who could easily have positioned himself as the hero of the story. Instead, he had embraced the more complex role of witness and participant in a system that required transformation rather than simple villains and saviors. As evening fell, Zora's phone rang with a call from Officer Perkins. I wanted to share something before you make your decision, he said after brief greetings. In 20 years of policing, I've seen how both punitive and transformative approaches play out long-term. And your assessment? Zora asked. Punishment creates compliance based on fear of consequences, he replied thoughtfully. Transformation creates change based on genuine understanding. Both have their place, but only one addresses root causes. The transformation approach requires more from the people who were harmed, Zora observed, voicing her central concern. It does, Perkins acknowledged, which is why it should never be expected or demanded. It's a gift, not an obligation.
and it's completely valid to choose a path that requires less of your emotional resources. His perspective echoed Zora's own thinking, that the choice before her wasn't merely about what would create the best outcome, but what would honor her own needs and boundaries in the process. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That helps clarify things." After ending the call, Zora sat on her balcony watching Seattle's skyline illuminate against the darkening sky. The paths before her were becoming clearer, though the choice remained complex. The lawsuit offered public accountability and potentially significant resources that could fund broader initiatives. The restorative process offered deeper transformation, but required substantial emotional investment. Perhaps the most powerful approach would combine elements of both, using legal leverage to ensure concrete changes while participating in the restorative work that might create lasting transformation. Her phone buzzed one final time that evening. A message from her mentor at MIT, Dr. Eleanor Graves, responding to Zora's earlier request for guidance. "Zora, you asked what approach would create the most meaningful legacy from this difficult experience. Having watched you navigate complex ethical terrain since you were my student, I trust you to make the right choice for yourself. What I will say is this. Throughout history, those who have created lasting change have rarely followed established paths. They have instead forged new ones that address the fullness of complex problems, rather than just their most visible symptoms. Whatever you decide, remember that your research remains vitally important. Don't let this incident, or its resolution, define your contribution to the field. With confidence in your judgment, Eleanor." The message crystallized something Zora had been feeling intuitively, that perhaps the binary choice between legal action and restorative justice was itself a limitation. The most powerful response might be one that hadn't been tried before, one that created both immediate accountability and long-term transformation. She reached for her laptop and began drafting an email to Maya Jefferson, Amelia Richardson, and Dr. Washington, outlining a hybrid approach that would leverage both legal and restorative frameworks. It would require more complex coordination and commitment from all parties, but it might also create a model for addressing similar incidents that combine the strengths of multiple approaches. As she wrote, the weight of decision began to lift. The path forward wasn't about choosing between justice and healing, but about creating a response that honored both, one that might actually prevent the next Dr. Mitchell from experiencing what she had endured at the hands of the next Karen Whitfield. The proposed framework wouldn't be perfect, and the road ahead remained challenging. But for the first time since the confrontation 2 weeks earlier, Zora felt something like hope, not just for resolution of this specific incident, but for the possibility of genuine transformation in how tech spaces addressed issues of belonging, identity, and power. She finished the email and sent it, knowing that her proposal would likely evolve through discussion and negotiation. The uncertainty didn't trouble her. Creating a more just algorithm always required multiple iterations, testing, and refinement. Why should creating a more just process be any different? The Lakeside Community Center occupied a renovated warehouse far from Horizon Tower, and the media attention still occasionally flaring around the incident. Natural light streamed through skylights onto a perfect circle of chairs, no tables to hide behind, no hierarchy in the seating. Zora arrived 15 minutes early, finding Dr. Imani Washington already setting up the space. "Dr. Mitchell," she greeted warmly. "Thank you for arriving early. It gives us a moment to check in before we begin." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of negotiations, resulting in the hybrid approach Zora had proposed. Legal agreements had secured concrete changes at Horizon Tower, revised security protocols, mandatory bias training, and a substantial investment in diversifying the incubator's research teams. These existed alongside but separate from the restorative process beginning today. "How are you feeling about this first session?" Dr. Washington asked, arranging small electric candles in the center of the circle. "Cautiously optimistic,"
Zora replied honestly. "Though I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't just elaborate performance art for Karen's redemption."
Dr. Washington nodded, unsurprised. A reasonable concern. What I can tell you is that performance doesn't survive this process for long. The work itself strips away pretense, often painfully so. The others arrived in quick succession. Marcus, Chen with a tentative smile, Vanessa Lopez carrying a leather portfolio, Officer James Perkins in casual clothes that still conveyed authority, Amelia Richardson looking slightly less polished than usual, and finally, Karen Whitfield, entering, with visible apprehension. "Welcome, everyone," Dr. Washington began once they were seated. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that each of you has chosen to be here despite having other options. That choice demonstrates courage, regardless of what brought you to this circle." She lit the center candle, a simple ritual that shifted the atmosphere from tense anticipation to focused attention. Today's session has two primary objectives: establishing shared agreements about how we'll work together, and creating space for each person to share their uninterrupted perspective on what happened and its impact. We won't be problem-solving or debating. We're simply laying the foundation of truth upon which any meaningful transformation must be built. Dr. Washington displayed proposed agreements on a screen. 1. Speak from personal experience using I statements. 2. Listen without interrupting or preparing a defense. 3. Acknowledge impact regardless of intention. 4. Maintain confidentiality about personal revelations. 5. Commit to staying present even when uncomfortable. 6. Recognize that understanding does not require agreement. Focus on patterns and systems, not just individual actions. The group discussed the agreements thoughtfully, with Vanessa suggesting an addition about avoiding corporate language that obscured meaning, and Marcus requesting clarity about what level of public sharing was appropriate. After 30 minutes, the refined agreements were documented and accepted by all. "Now we move to the heart of today's work," Dr. Washington continued. "Each person will have uninterrupted time to share their experience of what happened, not just the incident itself, but the context surrounding it and its impact. I suggest beginning with Dr. Mitchell, as the person most directly affected." All eyes turned to Zora. She had prepared for this moment, determining what she was willing to share while protecting her own boundaries. "What happened at Horizon Tower wasn't an isolated incident," Zora began, her voice steady. "It was one moment in a lifetime of similar experiences, being questioned, doubted, required to prove my legitimacy in spaces where others are presumed to belong." She described growing up as the daughter of academics, learning early that her intelligence would be questioned in ways her white classmates never was. She shared experiences from her academic career: the professor who repeatedly attributed her work to male colleagues, the conference where she was mistaken for catering staff while presenting groundbreaking research, the funding committees that questioned her objectivity when researching algorithmic bias. "The algorithms I study fail to recognize darker faces because they were trained on datasets that center whiteness as the default human experience," she explained. What happened with Ms. Whitfield demonstrates the same pattern. She had been trained by our culture to see whiteness as belonging and blackness as inherently suspicious. Zora spoke for nearly 20 minutes, articulating connections between her personal experience and broader systemic patterns, without once raising her voice or displaying the anger she would have been fully justified in expressing. "When I was prevented from entering my lab that night, what hurt most wasn't the incident itself, but the familiar weight of it, the exhausting recognition that no matter my credentials, accomplishments, or contributions, I can still be reduced to a threat based solely on my appearance." She paused, making brief eye contact with Karen. And what made it particularly painful was that it came from someone who has built a career claiming to address the very biases she was enacting. Karen visibly flinched but remained silent, honoring the agreement not to interrupt. "I agreed to this process not because I'm particularly interested in Ms. Whitfield's growth or Horizon Tower's reputation, but because I'm tired of these incidents being treated as isolated misunderstandings rather than symptoms of deeper problems. If this process can create something more meaningful than another diversity task force or sensitivity training, then perhaps my experience can serve a purpose beyond my own personal closure." When Zora concluded, Dr. Washington allowed the silence, to stretch for several moments before speaking. "Thank you for sharing with such clarity and courage," she said simply.
Would anyone like to respond? Not with defense or solution, but with acknowledgement of what you heard? Marcus spoke first. "I heard how exhausting it must be to constantly navigate spaces that claim inclusivity while still requiring you to continuously prove your right to exist within them." Vanessa nodded. "I heard the profound disconnect between what organizations like mine claim to address and what we actually perpetuate through superficial approaches." One by one, each participant shared a brief reflection. Karen struggled visibly, starting several times before finally managing. "I heard how my actions were part of a pattern that has followed you throughout your life, making what I might have seen as a single incident carry much deeper significance." "Who would like to share next?" Dr. Washington asked. Karen straightened in her chair. "I think it should be me. I need to take responsibility for my role." "Very well," Dr. Washington agreed. "Remember, this isn't about defense or justification, but honest sharing of your experience and perspective." Karen took a deep breath. "I've spent the past month trying to understand why I did what I did that night. The easy explanation would be that I was just following security protocols, but that's not the truth, and everyone here knows it." Her voice wavered slightly. "The truth is that when I saw Dr. Mitchell, I made immediate assumptions based on how she looked. I didn't consciously think I'm going to discriminate against this black woman. I thought I was being vigilant, thorough, protective of the building. But I didn't apply that same vigilance to the white employees who entered." She described her background, growing up in a predominantly white suburb where difference was viewed with suspicion, building a diversity consulting business after witnessing a discrimination lawsuit at her previous workplace and recognizing a market opportunity rather than a moral imperative. "I convinced myself that good intentions were enough, that by talking about diversity and inclusion, I was automatically practicing it." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "I charged companies thousands of dollars to help them appear more diverse without ever deeply examining my own biases or the systems that benefit people like me." Karen looked directly at Zora. "When I called the police on you, I was enacting the very behaviors my company claimed to prevent. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, and I've spent weeks trying to avoid facing it directly." She described the collapse of her company, not as a bid for sympathy, but as context for her initial defensive reactions. "I was so focused on the consequences to me that I couldn't see beyond them to the harm I had caused. It was only when I finally stopped trying to salvage my reputation and started asking myself honest questions that I began to understand what had actually happened. The vulnerability created a different kind of tension, not hostility, but the discomfort of witnessing someone confront painful truths about themselves." When Karen finished, Zora spoke with measured restraint. "I heard someone beginning to distinguish between intentions and impact, which is essential to any meaningful accountability." Marcus described his internal conflict witnessing the confrontation, the fear of speaking up directly versus documenting from a distance, his subsequent discomfort with benefiting professionally, his ongoing questions about what true allyship required. Amelia acknowledged the limitations of corporate diversity initiatives. "We created policies that looked progressive on paper while failing to address the underlying culture that made what happened to Dr. Mitchell possible. I've been complicit in building systems that prioritize the appearance of inclusion over its reality." Vanessa provided crucial context about the diversity consulting industry. "Companies like Inclusive Spaces profit from problems we have no real incentive to solve. If racism and bias were actually eliminated, our business model would collapse. That fundamental contradiction has corrupted the entire field." Officer Perkins offered statistics about similar calls and their potential dangers. "In the past 5 years, our department has received over 300 calls about suspicious persons in corporate buildings who turned out to be legitimate employees. In 78% of those cases, the suspicious person was black or brown." What happened at Horizon Tower wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that places people of color at risk simply for existing in professional spaces. As the final sharing concluded,
Dr. Washington guided a brief reflection on patterns or themes that had emerged. I noticed that everyone has mentioned systems and structures, not just individual actions, Vanessa observed. What happened that night wasn't just about Karen and Zora as individuals, but about the environments that shaped both their behaviors and their interpretations. Marcus nodded. I also noticed how differently each of us experienced the same incident, based on our positions and past experiences. What was traumatically familiar to Dr. Mitchell was invisible to others until it was explicitly documented. As their scheduled time drew to a close, Dr. Washington distributed personalized reflection cards to each participant. These aren't for sharing unless you choose to do so. They're prompts for deeper examination of the patterns we've begun to identify today. Zora glanced at her card. What would meaningful repair look like beyond institutional changes? What do you need personally from this process that hasn't been addressed through legal remedies? Additionally, Dr. Washington continued, I encourage each of you to document your reflections between sessions, not for me or for the group, but for your own processing. This work doesn't happen only when we're together in this room. As they prepared to leave, Karen approached Zora hesitantly. I know we're not friends and likely never will be, she said quietly, but I want to thank you for creating the possibility of something meaningful coming from. You could have simply taken the settlement and walked away. Zora studied her for a moment. This process isn't a gift I'm giving you, Ms. Whitfield. It's an investment I'm making in changing systems that harm people who look like me. Your growth is secondary to that larger purpose. Karen nodded, accepting the boundary without defensiveness. I understand, and I respect that clarity. Outside, Vanessa fell into step beside Zora as they walked toward the parking lot. That was intense, Vanessa observed. Are you okay? I'm fine, Zora replied automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, I'm exhausted. Being that honest in a room with the person who caused harm while still maintaining composure is emotionally draining. Vanessa nodded. The double consciousness of it all, having to monitor your own reactions while processing everyone else's sharing. Exactly. Zora appreciated being understood without having to explain. But I also feel, I don't know if hopeful is the right word, but perhaps cautiously optimistic that something meaningful might emerge from this process. I think it already has, Vanessa said thoughtfully. The level of honesty in that room was unlike anything I experienced in 5 years at Inclusive Spaces. No corporate language, no strategic positioning, just people speaking difficult truths. I'm curious, Zora said. The question on your card, would you mind sharing what Dr. Washington asked you to reflect on? Vanessa smiled slightly. She asked me to consider my responsibility as someone who was part of the system that enabled what happened, even though I wasn't directly involved in the incident itself, and to reflect on what true allyship requires beyond leaving a problematic company. As Zora drove home, she reflected on the session. The process had been demanding in ways she'd anticipated and others she hadn't.
Yet beneath the emotional exhaustion, she sensed the possibility of something unexpected. Not forgiveness or reconciliation, but a pathway toward transforming the systems that had made the incident possible. At home, she found an email from the National Science Foundation confirming the renewal of her research grant without contingencies or concerns about the recent publicity. The formal resolution with Horizon Tower had apparently satisfied their requirements. She turned to Dr. Washington's reflection questions, considering what meaningful repair might look like beyond the institutional changes already secured through legal means. After careful consideration, she began writing in a new journal. Meaningful repair would include recognition that the burden of education should not fall consistently on those who experience discrimination. It would involve white colleagues doing their own work without requiring my guidance or approval. It would mean that my professional accomplishments are evaluated separately from my identity as a Black woman. And perhaps most importantly, it would create spaces where I don't have to maintain hypervigilance about how my presence and responses are perceived. What I need personally from this process is more difficult to articulate. The legal settlement provided formal accountability. My research continues with secure funding.
What remains is harder to define. Perhaps a sense that my experience has created lasting change rather than just temporary discomfort for those responsible. The reflection brought clarity about her own boundaries and expectations. She wasn't seeking friendship with Karen or absolution for Horizon Tower. She was working toward systemic transformation that might prevent similar incidents for others, a goal aligned with her research on algorithmic bias but expanded to address the human systems that created and perpetuated such biases. The path was uncertain, the outcome not guaranteed, but the possibility of meaningful change, however difficult and imperfect, was worth the additional emotional labor the process required. Not because Karen Whitfield deserved redemption, but because systems of discrimination deserved dismantling, and this process might create a model for doing exactly that. "Let's begin by checking in," Dr. Washington said, her calm voice anchoring the group as they gathered for their fourth session. "What's emerged for each of you since we last met?" 6 weeks into the process, the circle had developed its own rhythm. The initial tension had evolved into something more complex. Not comfort exactly, but a shared commitment to honesty that created its own kind of safety. They had moved beyond the incident itself to examine the systems and patterns that made it possible. "I've been reflecting on something that came up last time," Karen said, breaking the silence that had settled after Dr. Washington's question, about the origins of inclusive spaces. All eyes turned to her, curiosity evident. Karen had been increasingly forthcoming in recent sessions, but she still struggled with layers of defensiveness that would surface unexpectedly. "I've always described the company's founding as inspired by a discrimination lawsuit I witnessed at my previous workplace," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "That's technically true, but it's not the whole truth." She took a deep breath. "The lawsuit was actually against me, among others in leadership. I was the HR director who dismissed multiple complaints from Black employees about hostile treatment. When they finally sued, I was named specifically for creating retaliatory conditions after their initial complaints. The revelation landed heavily in the room." Karen continued, her voice steadier now that the truth was emerging. "The company settled quietly. Nothing was ever publicly filed. But I saw the opportunity in the growing corporate interest in diversity."
Meaning, I positioned myself as an expert based on what I claimed to have learned from watching the situation unfold, never admitting I was centrally involved.
"So, Inclusive Spaces was built on a fundamental deception," Vanessa said quietly, the hurt evident in her voice despite her measured tone. Karen nodded. "The ultimate performance. I convinced myself I was making amends by helping other companies avoid similar lawsuits, but it was never about justice or transformation. It was about market opportunity and rebranding myself." Dr. Washington allowed the weight of this disclosure to settle before asking, "What prompted you to share this now?" "Because we've been talking about systemic change," Karen replied. "And I've realized that the rot in my company went all the way to its foundation. You can't transform something built on such a fundamentally flawed premise." The honesty created
A subtle shift in the room, a deepening of trust that came from vulnerability rather than strategic disclosure.
It was the kind of truth that couldn't be used for reputation repair or public redemption. It was simply the painful reality Karen had finally become willing to face. "Thank you for that honesty," Dr. Washington acknowledged. "Would anyone else like to share what's emerged since our last session?" "I've been connecting the patterns we've discussed to my research," Zora said, shifting the focus. Over the weeks, she had gradually grown more willing to bring her professional expertise into the process, seeing connections between algorithmic and human bias. "The facial recognition systems I study fail in predictable patterns," she explained. "They misidentify darker-skinned faces because they were primarily trained on datasets of lighter-skinned ones. The algorithms aren't intentionally biased. They simply reflect and amplify the biases in their training data." She made eye contact with Karen briefly. "Human systems work similarly. Security protocols that seem neutral on paper become discriminatory in practice because they're implemented by people trained on cultural datasets that associate whiteness with belonging and blackness with suspicion." "That's fascinating," Amelia said, leaning forward. Are there ways to retrain the algorithms that might apply to human systems as well? There are, Zora confirmed, but it requires intentionally diversifying the training data and regularly testing for bias against specific populations. It also means designing systems with the explicit knowledge that bias exists and must be actively countered, not just assumed to be absent. For the next hour, the group explored connections between Zora's research and the security practices at Horizon Tower. What had begun as a conversation about a single incident had evolved into a sophisticated analysis of how seemingly neutral systems perpetuated discrimination through their design and implementation. This is exactly what we need for the security protocol overhaul, Amelia observed, taking notes continuously. Not just diversity training for security personnel, but fundamentally redesigned protocols that account for common patterns of bias. And regular testing, Officer Perkins added. Like the facial recognition algorithms, we need to routinely check whether the system is producing discriminatory outcomes, regardless of intent. As the session progressed, they began sketching the framework for comprehensive reforms at Horizon Tower. Not the superficial changes Amelia had initially proposed, but structural transformations informed by data, research, and lived experience. This is actually quite revolutionary, Marcus observed as the outline took shape on a shared document. Most corporate security systems are designed primarily around threat prevention with inclusion as an afterthought, if it's considered at all. This approach centers both equally. Dr. Washington guided the conversation skillfully, ensuring that the focus remained on substantive change rather than quick fixes or image repair. By the session's end, they had developed the bones of a security protocol that might actually prevent incidents like the one that had brought them together. As they prepared to leave, Vanessa approached Karen hesitantly. Could we talk privately? For a few minutes? They moved to a small breakout room while the others gathered their belongings. Zora watched them go, curious about the conversation but respectful of their privacy. Over the weeks, Vanessa had emerged as a bridge between perspectives, challenging Karen without dismissing her capacity for growth, supporting Zora without presuming to understand her experience fully. Those two have some things to figure out, Officer Perkins observed, falling into step beside Zora as they left the building. Indeed, Zora agreed. Vanessa invested years in a company she believed was doing meaningful work, only to discover its foundations were built on deception. How are you feeling about all this? Perkins asked. It's a lot of emotional labor on top of your actual job. Zora considered the question carefully. It's demanding, certainly, but I'm finding unexpected value in it. There's something, healing isn't quite the right word, perhaps validating in seeing my experience transformed into structural change rather than just individual consequences. Perkins nodded. Justice versus punishment. They're not always the same thing. Exactly, Zora replied, appreciating his understanding. The lawsuit provided formal accountability, but this process is creating something more meaningful, a template for transformation that might prevent similar incidents for others. Their conversation continued as they walked to the parking lot, discussing specific changes to when and how police should be called to private buildings. Perkins had become an unexpected ally, bringing his professional expertise to bear on policies that too often placed people of color at risk. 2 days later, Vanessa and Karen sat across from each other at a small cafe near the waterfront. It was their third meeting since their private conversation after the last session. A series of difficult but necessary discussions about the future of inclusive spaces. I've been thinking about your proposal, Karen said, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. Restructuring the company as a benefit corporation with majority ownership transferred to a board composed primarily of people of color. It's radical. It has to be, Vanessa replied. The company's foundation was flawed, but the infrastructure still exists. It could be repurposed for genuine transformation work rather than corporate performance. Karen nodded slowly. I built a business that profited from diversity without practicing it. The irony isn't lost on me. It's not about punishment, Vanessa clarified. It's about alignment. If the company is going to do authentic work, its ownership and governance should reflect that authenticity. They continued discussing details: how existing client contracts would be honored but reframed, how the company's methodology would be completely overhauled, how Karen would step back from leadership while remaining involved in a transitional capacity. Would you consider returning? Karen asked finally. Not to work for me, but to help lead this transition? Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She had found meaningful work at Authentic Inclusion Collaborative, a smaller firm but one aligned with her values. Returning to inclusive spaces, even under transformed conditions, carried both opportunity and risk. I'd need to think about it, she said honestly. But I'm open to the possibility, especially if it means creating something genuinely transformative from what happened. As their meeting concluded, Karen found herself facing a crossroads unlike any she'd encountered before. The path forward required surrendering control of the company she'd built, acknowledging its problematic foundations publicly, and committing to a radical restructuring with no guarantee of success. It was terrifying, humbling, and strangely liberating all at once. The fifth session brought new energy as participants began moving from analysis to action. Marcus shared the bystander intervention training he'd developed in collaboration with diversity educators from local universities. The program addresses the specific dynamics we've identified, he explained, presenting materials on a shared screen. It moves beyond generic "if you see something, say something" approaches to address the real barriers to intervention: fear of confrontation, uncertainty about what's happening, concern about professional consequences. The training included scenario-based exercises drawn from actual incidents, clear scripts for different intervention techniques, and specific protocols for documenting problematic patterns. Unlike typical corporate trainings, it focused on practical skills and systemic awareness, rather than abstract concepts or legal compliance. We're piloting it at Meridian next month, Marcus continued. All staff will participate, not just management,
and we'll track specific metrics to measure its effectiveness.
This is exactly the kind of substantive change we've been working toward, Dr. Washington observed. Not just awareness, but specific skills and accountability mechanisms. The group provided feedback, refining the training to address different workplace contexts and power dynamics. What had begun as Marcus's individual project had evolved into a collaborative endeavor that might be implemented across multiple organizations. As the session continued, Amelia outlined the resources Horizon Tower was committing to implementing the group's recommendations. The board has approved a dedicated budget line for these initiatives, independent from our general operations funds, she explained. This ensures the work continues regardless of economic pressures or leadership changes. Her commitment represented a significant evolution from her initial approach of damage control and image management. Through the process, Amelia had confronted her own complicity in creating environments where discrimination thrived, despite progressive policies on paper. The transformation wasn't just professional, but personal, a willingness to prioritize substantive change over superficial solutions. I've also been in discussions with the Technology Ethics Alliance about developing industry-wide standards based on our security protocol framework, she added. There's significant interest in
creating a model that other tech incubators and corporate buildings could adopt.
Zora found herself cautiously impressed by Amelia's evolution. That kind of cross-industry standardization could create meaningful scale for these changes, she acknowledged, especially if it's accompanied by robust accountability mechanisms. The conversation continued, with each participant contributing expertise to specific aspects of the emerging framework. Officer Perkins shared revisions to police response protocols for private building calls, developed in collaboration with his department's community relations team. Karen and Vanessa presented the restructuring plan for inclusive spaces, inviting feedback on governance structures and methodology overhauls. Throughout it all, Dr. Washington guided the process with subtle skill, ensuring the focus remained on systemic transformation, rather than individual redemption narratives or quick fixes. She challenged simplistic solutions, probed assumptions, and consistently redirected attention to the structural changes required for meaningful change. By the sixth session, They had developed concrete deliverables, a comprehensive security protocol framework, bystander intervention training, reformed police call guidelines, and a case study documenting both the incident and the transformative process that followed. These weren't mere recommendations or vague commitments, but detailed plans with implementation timelines, accountability mechanisms, and evaluation metrics. As we approach our final formal session next week, Dr. Washington said as their 6th meeting drew to a close, I'd like each of you to reflect on your individual journey through this process. What have you learned? How have you changed? What commitments will you carry forward when our structured time together concludes? The questions hung in the air, inviting deeper reflection than the typical corporate workshop evaluation. This wasn't about satisfaction scores or meeting expectations, but about genuine transformation, both personal and systemic. As they gathered their belongings, Zora found herself standing next to Karen, an occurrence that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. I wanted to thank you, Karen said quietly. Not for forgiveness or absolution. I know that's not what this process is about for you, but for creating the possibility of transformation rather than just consequences. It would have been easier for you to simply accept the settlement and move on. Zora studied her for a moment, recognizing the genuine change that had occurred. What happened that night revealed problems much larger than just you and me, she replied. Addressing just the incident without the systems behind it would have been like treating a symptom while ignoring the disease. Karen nodded. I understand that now, though I certainly didn't at the beginning. I was so focused on my own reputation and the consequences to my company that I couldn't see beyond them to the larger patterns. That's often how privilege functions, Zora observed. It allows people to see incidents as isolated rather than systemic, as misunderstandings rather than manifestations of deeper problems. I see that now, Karen acknowledged, though I suspect it's something I'll have to keep learning and relearning. The conversation wasn't warm or personal. They weren't friends and likely never would be, but it reflected a significant evolution from their initial antagonistic positioning to a shared commitment to addressing the systems that had brought them into conflict. As Zora drove home that evening, she reflected on her own transformation through the process. She had entered it skeptically, viewing it primarily as a means to create systemic change rather than personal healing. Yet something unexpected had emerged alongside the policy reforms and structural changes, a sense of agency in transforming a painful experience into a catalyst for meaningful impact. The restorative process hadn't erased the harm or absolved those responsible. It hadn't created artificial closure or performative reconciliation. Instead, it had channeled the energy of conflict into the creation of something potentially valuable. A framework for addressing bias that moved beyond both individual blame and institutional denial to create pathways for genuine transformation. There was still significant work ahead. The protocols and trainings needed to be implemented, evaluated, and refined. The case study required final edits before being shared with the broader tech community. The restructured inclusive spaces had to prove its new model could create genuine impact rather than just rebranded performance. But as Zora prepared for their final formal session, she found herself cautiously hopeful about what they had created together. Not an endpoint or resolution, but the beginning of a different approach to addressing the persistent patterns of bias that shaped both human interactions and technological systems. The process had revealed that superficial solutions couldn't create lasting change. Meaningful transformation required uncomfortable growth from everyone involved. A willingness to examine complicity, challenge assumptions, and commit to ongoing work rather than quick fixes. It wasn't easy or clean or simple, but then again, neither was justice. 6 months after the confrontation, Horizon Tower looked different. The lobby featured a new security desk designed for visibility and transparency. Clear signage explained access protocols in multiple languages. Most notably, the security team reflected the diversity of the building's occupants, a visible demonstration of the changes implemented since that fateful night. Dr. Zora Mitchell stood by the windows of the same conference room where the group had first gathered in tense opposition months earlier.
Today, the space had been transformed with soft lighting, comfortable seating arranged in a circle, and a table in the center bearing 6 candles and a stack of journals. "It doesn't feel like the same room," Marcus observed, joining her.
"It's not just the furniture," Zora replied. "It's us. We're not the same people who first sat here." One by one, the others arrived for the private ceremony, marking the completion of their formal restorative justice process. Vanessa Lopez in a vibrant blue suit reflecting her new leadership role, Officer James Perkins carrying a folder of implementation data, Amelia Richardson without her usual entourage of assistants, and finally Karen Whitfield, whose entire demeanor had shifted from corporate polish to something more authentic. Dr. Imani Washington was the last to enter, carrying her worn leather portfolio. Today marks not an ending, but a transition, from structured process to ongoing practice, from external facilitation to self-sustaining commitment. She lit the center candle. "We'll begin, as we always have, with honest reflection. What has this process meant for each of you? What will you carry forward?" Amelia spoke first, surprising everyone with her vulnerability. "When this incident first occurred, my immediate reaction was damage control. Protect the incubator's reputation, minimize liability, issue a statement, and move on. I saw it as a PR crisis rather than a human one." She glanced at Zora apologetically. "I've learned that quick fixes and surface-level solutions not only fail to address systemic problems, they actively perpetuate them by creating the illusion of progress." She gestured to the building around them. "The changes we've implemented aren't just new policies on paper or diversity statements on our website. They're fundamental restructurings of how we operate, from security protocols to hiring practices, to funding priorities." Officer Perkins shared next, describing the changes implemented within his police department. "We've completely overhauled our response protocols for private building calls. Dispatchers now ask specific questions to determine whether a genuine security threat exists before deploying officers." He placed a folder on the table. "In the past 6 months, we've seen a 64% reduction in calls that turn out to be non-incidents involving people of color in professional settings. That's not just statistics. That's dozens of people who weren't subjected to the humiliation and potential danger of unnecessary police contact." Marcus spoke about the bystander intervention program he'd developed, now being implemented across multiple tech companies. "What I've learned is that allyship isn't an identity you claim, but a practice you commit to daily. It's not about performing the right role in moments of crisis, but about ongoing work to transform the systems that create those crises in the first place." Vanessa described the complete restructuring of inclusive spaces. "We've reincorporated as a benefit corporation with a majority-diverse board of directors. Our methodology has been completely overhauled to focus on substantive transformation, rather than compliance or image management. The company that had once profited from superficial diversity work had been fundamentally reimagined. We still work with companies on diversity and inclusion," Vanessa explained, "but our approach is radically different. We measure success not by trainings delivered or policies written, but by concrete changes in hiring, retention, promotion, and organizational culture." Karen had remained silent throughout the others' reflections. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a humility that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "I built a career and a company around helping others appear more diverse without ever examining my own biases or privileges," she acknowledged. "What happened that night with Dr. Mitchell wasn't an anomaly or a misunderstanding. It was the inevitable result of that fundamental contradiction." She looked around the circle. "This process has been the most difficult and important work of my life. Not because it salvaged my reputation, it hasn't and shouldn't, but because it forced me to confront truths I'd spent a lifetime avoiding." The restructuring of inclusive spaces had included Karen stepping back from leadership while remaining involved in a transitional capacity. She now worked primarily behind the scenes, contributing her institutional knowledge while allowing new voices to guide the company's transformation. "I've learned that true accountability isn't about public apologies or performative gestures," she continued. "It's about concrete actions that create tangible change even especially when those actions require surrendering power and privilege. All eyes turned to Zora, who had listened to each reflection with thoughtful attention.
Throughout the process, she had maintained the clearest boundaries, participating fully in the work while being selective about what personal vulnerabilities she shared. When I agreed to this process, I was skeptical about its potential for
creating meaningful change, she began. I'd seen too many diversity initiatives and reconciliation efforts that prioritized comfortable conversations over uncomfortable transformation. She glanced at Dr. Washington with appreciation. What made this different was its unflinching commitment to truth, its focus on systemic rather than just individual change, and its integration with concrete accountability mechanisms. The hybrid approach Zora had proposed, combining legal accountability with restorative process, had created both immediate consequences and long-term transformation. The settlement had provided resources for structural changes, while the restorative work had addressed the deeper patterns that made the incident possible. My research on algorithmic bias has always focused on how systems perpetuate discrimination, even without explicit intent, Zora continued. This process has allowed me to apply that same analysis to human systems, identifying the patterns and structures that enable bias to persist despite policies meant to prevent it. She shared news of her expanded research initiative, funded by a coalition of tech companies and civil rights organizations. We're developing new methodologies for identifying and addressing bias in both technological and human systems. As each person shared, Dr. Washington listened attentively. When all had spoken, she placed 6 journals on the table, one for each participant. These contain the reflections you've written throughout our time together, she explained. They represent not just where you've been, but the ongoing work ahead. She lit the remaining candles, passing one to each person. This ceremony marks a transition, not an end point. The formal process concludes, but the work continues, in your organizations, in your communities, and in yourselves. 2 hours later, the private ceremony had transformed into a public presentation. Horizon Tower's largest meeting space was filled with representatives from tech companies, security firms, diversity organizations, and media outlets. Amelia opened the presentation with characteristic poise, but her message differed markedly from her typical corporate rhetoric. What we're sharing today isn't a PR initiative or diversity program, she clarified. It's a fundamental reimagining of how technology spaces can address bias, belonging, and security as interconnected rather than competing priorities. The presentation unfolded as a collaborative effort. Marcus and Officer Perkins presented the bystander intervention training and reformed police call protocols. Vanessa outlined the methodology for identifying and addressing systemic bias in organizational structures. Karen spoke briefly but powerfully about the transformation of inclusive spaces, acknowledging its problematic origins and redirected purpose. Zora delivered the keynote, connecting her research on algorithmic bias to the human systems they'd addressed through their work together. The facial recognition technology I study fails in predictable patterns because it's trained on datasets that center certain experiences while marginalizing others, she explained. Human security systems fail in similar ways when they're designed without acknowledging the biases embedded in our cultural training. She presented preliminary data from the implementation of their security protocols, showing promising reductions in incidents of bias-based questioning and escalation. These aren't just statistics, she emphasized. They represent real people who can now access their workplaces without being treated as inherently suspicious. The presentation concluded with the official launch of the full case study and best practices guide, freely available to any organization committed to implementing the recommended changes. Unlike typical corporate diversity materials, these resources included robust accountability mechanisms, implementation timelines, and evaluation metrics. This isn't a template to be adopted wholesale, Zora clarified. It's a framework that must be adapted to specific contexts through ongoing collaboration with the people most affected by these systems. The process matters as much as the product. As attendees mingled after the formal presentation, Zora found herself approached by the CEO of a prominent AI development firm. Dr. Mitchell, your research connecting algorithmic and human bias is fascinating, he began. We'd like to explore potential collaboration as we develop our next-generation facial recognition system. 6 months earlier, such an opportunity would have been her primary focus. Today, she had additional questions. I'd be interested in discussing that, she replied. But I'd want to understand your commitment to addressing bias throughout your development process, not just as a technical problem to be solved after the fact. Her response reflected the evolution in her own approach, not abandoning her research passion, but contextualizing it within broader questions of justice and accountability. Across the room, Vanessa was engaged in animated conversation with diversity officers from several tech companies, articulating the difference between performance and practice in corporate inclusion work. Her natural leadership abilities, once constrained within Karen's company, now found full expression as she guided others toward more authentic approaches. Marcus had gathered a small group interested in implementing the bystander intervention program, explaining the specific mechanisms that distinguished it from typical corporate trainings. His initially hesitant voice had transformed into confident advocacy, grounded in both personal experience and rigorous development work. As the event began winding down, Zora noticed Karen standing alone by the windows. She approached slowly, maintaining the careful boundary that had characterized their relationship throughout the process. The presentation went well, Zora observed, standing beside her but looking out at the Seattle skyline rather than making direct eye contact. It did, Karen agreed. Though I still find it strange to be presenting about transformation when I was the one who caused harm in the first place. That complexity is part of what makes the case study valuable, Zora replied. It's not a simple narrative of villains and heroes, but a more honest examination of how systems shape behaviors and how genuine change requires more than just removing bad actors. Karen nodded slowly. 6 months ago, I was so focused on protecting my reputation that I couldn't see beyond it to the actual harm I'd caused. The irony of building a diversity company while perpetuating the very biases I claimed to address. She shook her head. The blindness was breathtaking. Recognition is the first step, Zora acknowledged. But the more important question is, what you do with that recognition moving forward. That's the daily work now, Karen said quietly. Not just for me, but for all the systems that made what happened possible. They stood in silence for a moment, two people forever connected by a painful interaction that had catalyzed unexpected transformation. They weren't friends and likely never would be. Too much asymmetry existed in their experiences and positions. But they had created something valuable from their collision, something that might prevent similar harm for others. As the event concluded, the core group gathered one final time. Dr. Washington joined them briefly, offering a final observation. True resolution isn't a neat endpoint, she reminded them. It's an ongoing commitment to growth and vigilance against the biases that persist in all systems and individuals. The words resonated with everyone present, acknowledging both how much had been accomplished and how much work remained. The security protocols, bystander training, and organizational restructuring were significant achievements, but they required continued attention and refinement to create lasting change. As Zora left Horizon Tower that evening, she passed through the redesigned security area, now staffed by a diverse team implementing the protocols developed through their work together. The guard nodded respectfully, recognizing her without requiring additional verification beyond her properly displayed credentials. It was a small moment, yet emblematic of the larger transformation. 6 months earlier, a similar interaction had spiraled into confrontation, exposure, and eventually, a painful reckoning. Today, it unfolded as it should have then, a routine, interaction characterized by professionalism and respect. The incident that had brought them all together hadn't been erased or forgotten. It remained a painful reality in Zora's experience and a shameful one in Karen's. But it had also become something else, a catalyst for creating systems that might prevent similar harm for others, a case study in how genuine accountability could lead to meaningful transformation, and a reminder that true inclusion required ongoing vigilance rather than performative declarations. As she stepped into the cool evening air, Zora felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride in what they'd accomplished, awareness of how much work remained, and cautious hope that their efforts might contribute to more just systems in both technological and human realms. The path forward wasn't perfect or guaranteed. Biases persisted in algorithms and human interactions alike. Corporate interests still often prioritized appearance over substance. Power imbalances continued to shape who was questioned and who was presumed to belong. But something had shifted, at least within their sphere of influence. The incident that could have remained a painful memory, a viral outrage cycle, or a superficial diversity initiative had instead become the foundation for substantive change, not just in policies or protocols, but in the underlying structures that determined whose experiences were centered and whose were marginalized. As Seattle's lights began illuminating the darkening sky, Zora headed toward her laboratory where important research awaited her attention. The work continued, both in algorithms and human systems, both in research and practice, both in policies and everyday interactions. The journey wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be. But it was moving in the right direction, step by uncomfortable, necessary step. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.